Between March of 1852 and October of 1853, 7 young men from Boston's most distinguished families perished under conditions the city's coroner dismissed as regrettable accidents. What officials never connected, or perhaps chose not to, was that every victim had entered into a strange agreement with Margaret Lawrence, the wealthiest widow residing on Beacon Hill, precisely 9 months before their deaths. The agreement promised $3,000 in exchange for services that polite society would never dare discuss openly. When Dr. Samuel Hewitt began seeing patients in the neighborhood around the Lawrence estate, he noticed something the city's upper class had worked diligently to conceal. A recurring pattern of tragedy that traced directly back to one of Boston's most esteemed families. What he uncovered beyond the iron gates of that property would shatter his faith in human decency and force him to decide between his medical career and his moral conscience. Before we continue with the tale of the Lawrence family and the darkness that consumed Beacon Hill, we want to know where you are listening from. Subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us which state or city you call home. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this into the light. The truth surrounding what occurred in that mansion would stay buried for decades, concealed beneath layers of money, influence, and carefully preserved silence. But every secret, no matter how well guarded, eventually finds its way to the surface. Boston in 1852 stood at the peak of its prosperity. The textile mills lining the Charles River had generated fortunes for families whose names graced buildings, streets, and charitable institutions throughout the city. Beacon Hill remained the crown jewel of this wealth, where federal-style mansions lined cobblestone streets and gas lamps burned well into the evening hours, casting warm light upon doorways that opened only to those of proper breeding and adequate fortune. The Lawrence mansion occupied nearly half a city block on Mount Vernon Street, its red brick facade climbing 4 stories above a granite foundation laid in 1798. Wrought iron fencing encircled the property, and mature elm trees provided shade during summer months and skeletal elegance through winter. The house had been constructed by shipping magnate Josiah Lawrence, whose fortune had grown considerably during the Napoleonic Wars. His grandson Thomas Lawrence had multiplied that fortune by investing heavily in the textile trade, transforming the family from merely prosperous to genuinely powerful. Thomas had died suddenly in February of 1851, leaving behind his widow Margaret and their 3 daughters, Catherine aged 22, Elizabeth aged 20, and Anne aged 18. The circumstances surrounding his death had raised a few eyebrows. A tumble down the grand staircase during a dinner gathering attended by 2 judges, a congressman, and the mayor himself. But the coroner had declared it accidental without meaningful inquiry. Thomas had been drinking that evening, witnesses confirmed. Such tragedies occurred even in the finest households. Margaret Lawrence had mourned in the appropriate fashion, wearing black for the prescribed duration, but those who knew her closely detected something peculiar about her grief. She appeared less devastated than purposeful, as though her husband's passing had liberated her to pursue some long-delayed ambition. At 43, she remained a commanding presence, tall and severe, with gray eyes that seemed to assess the worth of every person who entered her space. She had been born Margaret von Haussmann in Prussia, immigrating to Boston alongside her parents in 1827 when she was 19 years old. Her father, a professor of natural philosophy, had secured a position at Harvard, and Margaret had swiftly mastered the manners and speech of Boston society, though she never entirely shed the faint accent that identified her as foreign-born. The neighborhood surrounding the Lawrence estate consisted primarily of similar households, wealthy families who had built their fortunes through shipping, textiles, or banking. The streets remained tranquil during daylight hours, disturbed only by passing carriages and the discreet movements of servants. Children from these households attended the finest schools, and daughters were groomed for advantageous marriages that would unite fortunes and preserve the social hierarchy that kept Boston's elite firmly in command. Dr. Samuel Hewitt had established his practice on Charles Street in early 1852, having completed his medical training at Harvard just 6 months prior. At 27, he was young for a physician, yet his skills and dedication had earned respect from his professors. He had chosen to practice on Beacon Hill specifically because he believed he could serve the community while simultaneously building a reputation that might eventually allow him to open a teaching hospital. His own family background was respectable but modest. His father had taught school in Salem, and Samuel had worked his way through medical training by tutoring wealthier students. His practice grew slowly at first. The established households of Beacon Hill already had their preferred physicians, men who had attended their fathers and grandfathers, whose discretion was legendary and whose loyalty was assured. But Samuel had youth on his side and a willingness to make house calls at unusual hours, and gradually he began assembling a patient list that included merchants, clerks, and servants throughout the neighborhood. It was through treating servants that Samuel first encountered whispers about the Lawrence household. A maid named Bridget O'Sullivan, suffering from a fever, had visited his office in late May of 1852. As he examined her and prepared a tonic, she mentioned that her mistress was seeking additional household staff, particularly young women willing to work in a separate wing of the mansion. "Is it a large household?" Samuel had inquired, making conversation. "Larger than you might expect, Doctor," Bridget had answered, her voice carrying an unusual quality. "Mrs. Lawrence keeps many rooms occupied, though few ever see who occupies them." Before Samuel could press further, Bridget had shifted the subject, asking about her prognosis and when she might return to work. But the comment lingered with him, a peculiar phrasing suggesting something beyond a wealthy widow's eccentricity. The Lawrence daughters had rarely been seen publicly before their father's death. They had attended services at Trinity Church, had been presented at appropriate social gatherings, and had received callers on designated afternoons. But following Thomas Lawrence's funeral, they had retreated behind the mansion's walls and remained there. When Samuel occasionally caught glimpses of them through windows during his neighborhood walks, they appeared pale and withdrawn, drifting through the house like specters haunting their own home. Boston society operated according to rigid customs in 1852, customs governing everything from proper mourning periods to acceptable topics of conversation. Women of the Lawrence daughters' standing were expected to marry advantageously, produce heirs, and maintain the social position their families had labored generations to secure. The fact that all three remained unwed as they entered their 20s was unusual, though not yet scandalous. Their father's death provided a suitable excuse for delaying courtship, but that excuse would not endure indefinitely. The textile industry that had built the Lawrence fortune was entering a period of uncertainty. Competition from mills in Lowell and Lawrence threatened Boston's dominance, and the mounting political tensions surrounding slavery were disrupting cotton supplies from the South. Wealthy families understood that fortunes could vanish as rapidly as they were assembled, and preserving wealth demanded constant vigilance and strategic maneuvering. Margaret Lawrence had been raised in a different tradition than most Boston matrons. Her father's circle in Prussia had included natural philosophers, early anthropologists, and scholars fascinated by the scientific study of human heredity. While Boston's elite traced their bloodlines with pride, Margaret had been exposed to theories reaching far beyond simple genealogy, ideas about selective breeding, about the perfectibility of the human race through careful pairing of superior specimens. These theories, favored in certain European academic circles, proposed that humanity could be improved through the same principles farmers applied when breeding better livestock. Such ideas were not entirely foreign to America. Thomas Jefferson himself had written about the importance of natural aristocracy, yet Margaret had studied under professors who carried these concepts considerably further, who believed that systematic application of breeding principles could produce a new kind of human being, superior in intelligence, health, and capability. When she had raised these theories with her late husband, Thomas had dismissed them as continental nonsense, unsuitable for respectable Boston conversation. Now, with Thomas gone and her daughters entirely under her control, Margaret finally possessed the opportunity to test whether those theories held any merit. The Lawrence fortune would not endure forever, she recognized, but if she could produce a new generation that was genuinely superior, stronger, smarter, more capable, then her grandchildren would not merely preserve the family's standing, but surpass it entirely. They would be the foundation of a new aristocracy, grounded not in accumulated wealth but in biological excellence. The first step in her scheme required identifying suitable fathers for these superior children. Margaret had devoted months to examining the genealogies of Boston's oldest families, tracing bloodlines back to the Mayflower and beyond, searching for patterns of longevity, intelligence, and physical robustness. She had consulted a colleague of her father's who remained in correspondence through letters, a German physician named Hofmeister who had published papers on heredity in obscure scientific journals. His guidance had been straightforward. Select young men from families with documented histories of health and achievement. Confirm they were free from inherited defects, and document the results carefully. But Margaret had no intention of permitting these young men to become permanent fixtures of her household. The children they fathered would be raised according to her principles, educated as she determined, shaped into the superior beings she envisioned. The fathers were merely instruments, their function confined to providing the raw material. What became of them afterward was simply a matter of practical necessity. The first young man to put his name to Margaret Lawrence's contract was Jonathan Lowell, age 24, third son of a textile family whose mills employed 300 workers. He had arrived at the mansion on Charles Street on a wet afternoon in March of 1852, responding to a note delivered to his lodgings by a well-dressed servant. The note had been cryptic but intriguing. A business opportunity requiring discretion and offering substantial compensation. Jonathan had been shown into a parlor decorated in the French style, with wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes and furniture upholstered in deep blue velvet. Margaret Lawrence had received him alone, which was itself remarkable. Respectable widows did not typically meet unmarried young men without chaperones. She had offered him brandy, which he accepted, and then she had laid out her proposition with a directness that left him momentarily without words. "I have 3 daughters," she had said, her accent lending her words a peculiar formality. "They are of marriageable age, but I do not intend to marry them in the conventional manner. I require something different. I require men of excellent breeding who will agree to spend time with my daughters under specific circumstances for a specific purpose, and who will sign agreements ensuring their absolute silence about these arrangements." Jonathan had set down his brandy glass, uncertain whether he was being propositioned or presented with some form of business arrangement. "I do not understand, Mrs. Lawrence. What purpose would this serve?" "I am conducting an experiment," Margaret had replied, her gray eyes fixed upon his face. "I believe that careful selection of parentage can produce superior offspring. I have examined my daughter's genealogy thoroughly. I have studied your family's history as well. Your grandfather lived to 93. Your father graduated from Harvard with highest honors. Your mother's family has gone 3 generations without a single case of consumption, madness, or congenital defect. You represent excellent breeding material." The bluntness of the comparison had made Jonathan flush. "You speak of human beings as though we were livestock." "I speak of biological reality," Margaret had answered. "Farmers have understood for centuries that breeding matters. Why should humans be exempt from natural law? My daughters will bear children, Mr. Lowell. The only question is whether those children will result from random courtship and emotional attachment, or from careful scientific selection." She had produced the contract then, a document prepared by a lawyer and drafted in language attempting to frame the arrangement as a business transaction. In exchange for services rendered over a period not to exceed 3 months, Jonathan would receive $3,000, more than most men earned in 5 years. He would be expected to visit the mansion twice weekly, would be granted access to one of Margaret's daughters, and would be bound to absolute secrecy. Should he violate the terms of the agreement, he would forfeit the payment and face legal action for breach of contract. "This is immoral," Jonathan had said, though his voice carried little conviction. $3,000 could establish him in business, could free him from dependence on his family's declining fortunes. "Morality," Margaret had replied, "is what wealthy people define it to be. If I arranged marriages for my daughters according to conventional practice, trading their beauty and dowries for advantageous unions, society would applaud my wisdom. I am simply removing the pretense and applying scientific principle. My daughters will be provided for. Any children will be raised in comfort and given every advantage. You will be generously compensated for your contribution. Where precisely is the immorality? Jonathan had signed the contract that evening, though his hand trembled as pen met paper. Margaret had assigned him to Catherine, the eldest daughter, and established a schedule. Tuesday and Friday evenings, between 7 and 10, in a room on the third floor that had been prepared for this purpose. The first time Jonathan climbed those stairs to the third-floor room, his heart had been pounding so forcefully he thought he might collapse. Catherine had been waiting for him, dressed in a white nightgown, her face as pale as marble. She had not spoken a word to him, had not met his eyes. It had been immediately apparent that she was as much a victim of her mother's scheme as he was a participant. Over the following weeks, Jonathan had come to understand that Catherine was neither simple nor slow-witted as he had initially feared, but rather completely subjugated to her mother's will. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were measured and careful. She never smiled. She never expressed any opinion about the arrangement or anything else. She was 22 years old and had been molded into something barely recognizable as human, an instrument of her mother's ambitions. By June, Catherine's pregnancy had been confirmed by a physician Margaret employed, not one of Beacon Hill's respected doctors but a man from South Boston whose practice served the poor and who asked no questions so long as he was compensated. Jonathan's Tuesday and Friday visits had concluded, and he had received the first installment of his payment, $1,000 in gold coins. Margaret had summoned him to the parlor for a final meeting. "You have fulfilled your obligation admirably," she had told him. "The remainder of your payment will follow after the child is born, provided you maintain absolute silence about this arrangement. Should you speak of this to anyone, the consequences will be severe. I trust one make myself clear." "Perfectly clear, Mrs. Lawrence," Jonathan had replied, eager to be done with the entire affair. The money sat heavily in his pocket, and he had tried to persuade himself that he had done nothing truly wrong. Catherine would have married eventually, would have borne children eventually. What difference did it make that her mother had arranged matters unconventionally? But guilt had pursued him relentlessly. He found himself unable to look at women without recalling Catherine's vacant eyes, unable to spend the money without remembering how he had earned it. He had begun drinking more heavily, frequenting taverns in rougher neighborhoods where his shame was diluted by the general degradation surrounding him. On a rainy October evening, Jonathan Lowell had departed a tavern near the docks and begun walking home through streets slick with mud and manure. Witnesses later reported observing him stumble, intoxicated they assumed, and fall directly into the path of a freight wagon transporting barrels of whale oil from the harbor. The wagon's wheels had crushed his skull. The driver, employed by a shipping company with financial ties to Lawrence textile interests, had been briefly questioned and released. Accidental death, the coroner had ruled. A tragedy, though not uncommon in a city where men frequently wandered the streets in states of intoxication. Margaret Lawrence had attended the funeral, standing at the rear of the church, her expression appropriately somber. She had sent a generous arrangement of white lilies and a note of condolence to the Lowell family, then returned home to interview the next candidate. The pattern had repeated itself twice more. William Elbridge, descended from a family of shipbuilders, had been contracted to father a child with Elizabeth. He had fulfilled his role successfully, had received his payment, and had died 3 months later when he tumbled from the roof of a building he had been inspecting as a possible real estate investment. The building belonged to a trust managed by Margaret's attorney. Henry Cunningham, whose grandfather had served as governor of Massachusetts, had been paired with Anne, the youngest daughter. His death had been attributed to sudden heart failure, unusual in a man of 25, though not unheard of. The physician who had examined the body and signed the death certificate received a generous donation to his private hospital shortly thereafter. By late 1853, all 3 Lawrence daughters were with child and 3 young men were dead. Samuel Hewitt had not set out to investigate the deaths. His practice kept him occupied, and the misfortunes befalling prominent families were of no particular concern to him. But in November of 1853, he had been summoned to attend to a servant at the Lawrence mansion, a young woman named Mary Finnegan who had collapsed while working in the kitchen. A granite-faced butler had led Samuel through the mansion's main entrance, past a foyer dominated by a massive mahogany table supporting a vase of fresh flowers, and down a corridor toward the servants' quarters at the rear of the house. As they walked, Samuel had noticed something peculiar. The third-floor landing had been sealed off with a locked door, and he could detect movement above, footsteps and what sounded unmistakably like an infant crying. Mrs. Lawrence maintains a private ward for family members, the butler had explained, noticing Samuel's curious glance. It is not to be disturbed. Samuel had treated Mary Finnegan for exhaustion and malnutrition. She had been working 18-hour days and eating poorly, and he had recommended rest and improved meals. As he prepared to leave, he encountered one of the Lawrence daughters in the hallway. She had been heavily pregnant, her abdomen swollen beneath a loose dress, and she had regarded him with eyes holding no recognition or awareness, as though she were sleepwalking. "Miss Lawrence," Samuel had said, uncertain which daughter he was addressing. She had not responded, had simply continued toward the stairs with slow, measured steps. The butler had appeared immediately and guided Samuel firmly toward the exit. "The young ladies are not receiving visitors," he had said. "I must ask you to leave now, Doctor." The encounter had troubled Samuel more than he could properly articulate. Something had been profoundly wrong about the woman he had observed, something that extended beyond the physical discomfort of late pregnancy. She had moved like a puppet on strings, animated yet not truly alive. He had begun asking questions carefully and discreetly. Servants spoke freely to doctors, and Samuel had cultivated relationships with household staff throughout Beacon Hill. What he learned had disturbed him deeply. The Lawrence daughters had been essentially confined to the mansion since their father's passing. They never left the house, never received visitors, never attended church or social functions. Margaret Lawrence controlled every aspect of their existence, what they consumed, what they wore, when they slept. The pregnancies had been noticed by household staff, naturally, but no one knew who the fathers were. Young men had visited the mansion periodically but always after dark, always escorted directly to the third floor, always departing within a few hours. "Mrs. Lawrence keeps records," one servant had whispered to Samuel during a house call. "She has ledgers where she documents everything, measurements, observations, dates. She treats those girls as though they are experiments." Samuel had wanted to dismiss this as servants' gossip but could not shake the memory of that pregnant woman's vacant stare. He had begun researching Margaret Lawrence's background and had learned of her father's academic connections, of the theories about heredity and selective breeding that had circulated in European universities during the 1820s and 1830s. He had also taken note of the deaths. 3 young men from distinguished families, all dead within months of one another, all under circumstances ruled accidental but which struck Samuel as deeply suspicious. He had obtained copies of the death certificates from the city registrar, a former classmate who owed him a favor, and had examined them carefully. Jonathan Lowell, massive head trauma from a wagon accident, yet the coroner's report noted unusual bruising on his arms consistent with being forcibly restrained. This detail had appeared in the notes but had not been emphasized in the official conclusion. William Elbridge, a fall from height resulting in a broken neck, yet several witnesses had reported seeing him with 2 unidentified men shortly before his death, men who had never been located or questioned. Henry Cunningham, heart failure, yet the examining physician had noted needle marks on his arms suggesting he might have been receiving injections of some kind. This detail too had been disregarded in the final report. 3 deaths, 3 young men who had each been observed entering the Lawrence mansion in the months preceding their deaths, 3 families who had accepted the official explanations without significant resistance, suggesting either ignorance or deliberate silence purchased with money and influence. Samuel had understood then that he was confronting murder. but murder carried out by someone possessing enough power to control coroners, police officers, and perhaps even judges. Murder serving some larger purpose he had not yet fully grasped. In December of 1853, Catherine Lawrence had given birth to a son. The delivery had been attended by the same disreputable physician Margaret employed for all her private medical matters, and no announcement had been made to Boston society. The infant had been healthy, weighing 8 pounds, with the Lowell family's distinctive dark hair and strong features. Margaret had examined the baby carefully, measuring his head circumference, testing his reflexes, recording all her observations in leather-bound ledgers she kept secured in her study. The child had passed her evaluation and had been installed in the third-floor nursery, where he would be raised according to principles Margaret had developed over years of study. Elizabeth's daughter had arrived in January of 1854, and Anne's son in February. Both infants had been healthy and both had been subjected to the same meticulous examination. Margaret's experiment was progressing precisely as she had envisioned, but there had been a fourth pregnancy, one that had not been part of the original design. One of the young women Margaret had engaged to work in the third-floor nursery, a girl named Sophia Prescott from a respectable though impoverished family, had attracted William Elbridge's attention during one of his visits. She had become pregnant, and though Margaret had initially been furious about this uncontrolled variable, she had decided to permit the pregnancy to continue. Sophia came from sound bloodlines. Her family traced their ancestry to Plymouth Colony, and the child might prove useful for comparative purposes. Sophia's baby had arrived in March of 1854, a girl who appeared healthy initially but who developed a persistent cough by her second week of life. Margaret had monitored the situation carefully, consulting her ledgers and her correspondence with Hofmeister. The cough had indicated a pulmonary weakness, a potential inherited flaw that could compromise the child's long-term health. On a cold April morning, Sophia had woken to discover her daughter's cradle empty. When she had frantically searched the nursery and then run screaming through the corridors, Margaret had confronted her with cold fury. The child was defective, Margaret had said simply. She has been removed. Where is she? Where is my baby? Sophia had sobbed, her voice echoing through the mansion. That is no longer your concern. You will be compensated for your time and you will leave this household today. If you speak of this to anyone, I will have you institutionalized. Do you understand me? Sophia had understood. She had taken the $50 Margaret offered and had left the mansion that same morning. But she had not remained silent. Traumatized and desperate, she had gone to the only person she believed might help. The young physician on Charles Street who had once treated her for a fever. Samuel Hewitt had opened his door to find a hysterical young woman who could barely speak through her tears. When he finally comprehended what she was telling him, he had felt his blood turn cold. A missing infant, a woman who spoke of defects and removal with clinical detachment, a household where pregnant women were kept like breeding stock and their children evaluated like livestock. You must go to the police, Samuel had told Sophia. They will not listen to me, Sophia had replied, her voice fracturing. Mrs. Lawrence has money, has connections. I am nobody. They will declare me mad and lock me away exactly as she threatened. Samuel had known she was right. Margaret Lawrence's influence extended throughout Boston's entire power structure. Any accusation brought against her would be dismissed, and the accuser would face consequences. But he had also known he could not simply ignore what he had been told. Let me investigate, he had said. Quietly. If I can find evidence of what she is doing, then we can approach the authorities with proof they cannot dismiss. Sophia had agreed, though she had regarded him with little hope. Samuel had given her money for lodging and had promised to contact her within the week. That night, Samuel had begun planning how to gain entry to the third floor of the Lawrence mansion, where he was certain the answers lay concealed behind locked doors. Samuel's opportunity arrived sooner than anticipated. In late April, he had received an urgent summons to the Lawrence mansion. One of the daughters was experiencing complications following childbirth and required immediate medical attention. When Samuel arrived, the butler had led him directly to the third floor, unlocking the door with a large brass key and guiding him up a narrow staircase that carried the scent of milk and laudanum. The third floor had been converted into a private ward, with several bedrooms connected by a central corridor and a large nursery at the far end. And Lawrence, the youngest daughter, had been suffering from puerperal fever, her temperature dangerously elevated, her body racked with chills. Samuel had treated her with cold compresses and quinine, though he had recognized the prognosis was poor. Puerperal fever claimed half the women it infected, and was already severely weakened. As he worked, Samuel had taken careful notice of his surroundings. The rooms were well appointed but sterile, resembling hospital wards more than family quarters. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding medical texts and scientific journals. A desk near the window was covered with ledgers, their pages filled with precise handwriting, dates, measurements, observations. Margaret Lawrence had supervised his treatment of Anne, positioned in the corner of the room, observing everything he did through those calculating gray eyes. She had displayed no maternal warmth, no concern for her daughter's suffering. She had asked only clinical questions about the fever's progression and the likelihood of survival. If she dies, Margaret had remarked matter-of-factly, the child will require a wet nurse. Samuel had been taken aback by her coldness but had said nothing. As a physician, he was expected to maintain professional composure, but he had never encountered a mother so utterly devoid of feeling for her own child. While Margaret had briefly left the room to instruct a servant about boiling water, Samuel had quickly examined the ledgers on the desk. What he saw had confirmed his gravest fears. Margaret had been maintaining detailed records of everything. The names of the fathers she had selected, their family genealogies extending back generations, medical histories documenting longevity and cause of death among ancestors. She had recorded the dates when each young man had visited the mansion, the dates pregnancies had been confirmed, and elaborate notes about the physical characteristics she hoped to observe in the resulting children. There had been additional notations that made Samuel's blood run cold. J.L., disposal completed October 14th, no complications. We, disposal completed November 3rd. Method effective. H.C., disposal completed December 9th, injection method successful. The ledgers had documented murder, carefully orchestrated and executed with the clinical efficiency of a farmer eliminating inferior breeding stock. But even more disturbing had been the pages devoted to the children themselves. Each baby had been assigned a designation rather than a name. Subject A1, Catherine's son. Subject B1, Elizabeth's daughter. Subject C1, Anne's son. And Subject D1, Sophia's daughter. Margaret had recorded their weights, measurements, developmental milestones, and her evaluations of their potential. For Subject D1, there was a final entry. Persistent respiratory weakness, unsuitable for study. Removed April 3, 1854. Samuel had heard Margaret's footsteps returning and had quickly closed the ledger, his hands trembling. He had continued treating Anne, but his mind was racing. He now possessed direct evidence of Margaret's crimes, yet he had obtained it while functioning as her employee treating her daughter. Any attempt to use that information would require him to explain how he had acquired it, potentially compromising his medical ethics and his legal standing. And Lawrence had died 3 days later despite Samuel's best efforts. Margaret had shown no grief at her daughter's funeral, had simply arranged for the infant to be cared for by a hired wet nurse, and had resumed her work as though nothing of significance had occurred. Samuel had returned to his practice haunted by what he had witnessed. He had finally grasped the full scope of Margaret's design. She was attempting to create a new generation of superior human beings through selective breeding, documenting the process with scientific rigor, and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose her work. The young men who had fathered the children had been not partners in this undertaking but merely instruments to be discarded once they had served their function. But the most horrifying revelation had been the fate of the unsuitable children. Margaret was not simply conducting a breeding experiment. She was culling the results, eliminating infants who failed to meet her standards. Sophia's daughter had vanished, and Samuel had no way of knowing whether there had been others, previous attempts quietly erased from the record. He had understood then that he must act, yet he had also recognized the risks. Margaret Lawrence had already successfully killed 3 men without facing any consequences. She had influence over police, coroners, and city officials. If Samuel openly accused her, he would likely join Jonathan Lowell, William Elbridge, and Henry Cunningham in an early grave. What unfolded on the night of May 15, 1854, would alter everything. Samuel had been walking home late after attending a difficult childbirth in the North End. As he crossed Boston Common, he noticed a figure waiting near one of the gas lamps, a woman in servant's clothing, her face partly obscured by a shawl. It had been Catherine Lawrence. She had approached slowly, glancing around to confirm they were not being observed. When she spoke, her voice barely exceeded a whisper, yet it carried the desperation of someone who had at last found the courage to resist. "Dr. Hewitt, I need your help. My mother is planning to kill me." Samuel had stared at her in disbelief. Catherine's face, now visible in the lamplight, had been gaunt and pale, but her eyes held a clarity he had never witnessed in their previous encounters. Why would she do that? Samuel had asked, though he had suspected he already knew. "She has what she wanted from me," Catherine had said. "My son is healthy, developing according to her predictions. She has documented everything she requires. I am no longer necessary to her experiment, and I know too much. I overheard her speaking with her attorney last week. They were discussing arrangements for my unfortunate illness. She is planning to poison me gradually and have it attributed to lingering complications from childbirth." Catherine had produced a small vial from her pocket. "She has been adding this to my evening tea. I pretended to drink it tonight but saved it instead. Can you test it? Can you determine what it contains?" Samuel had taken the vial, his mind reeling. If Catherine was telling the truth, and he had no cause to doubt her, then Margaret was escalating her crimes, now prepared to murder her own daughter to protect her secrets. "Why me?" Samuel had asked. "Why come to me rather than the police?" "Because you already suspect her," Catherine had replied. "I have observed how you look at her when you attend patients in our house. You sense that something is wrong. And because you are young enough not to be in her pocket, not yet corrupted by money or fear. You are my only hope, Doctor." Samuel had agreed to help her, knowing it placed him directly in Margaret Lawrence's sights. He had instructed Catherine to pretend to continue drinking the tea, maintaining her appearance of submission while he worked to assemble evidence strong enough to bring Margaret before justice. The vial Catherine had given him had contained arsenic, as Samuel confirmed through chemical testing the following morning. It had been diluted sufficiently to avoid causing immediate dramatic symptoms, yet regular doses would have eventually produced organ failure easily attributed to natural causes, particularly in a woman already weakened by childbirth. Samuel had faced an impossible decision. He possessed evidence now, the vial of poison, the testimony of Margaret's daughter, his own observations from the 3rd floor. But was it sufficient? Margaret's wealth and influence might still prove insurmountable, particularly if she realized she had been exposed and moved swiftly to eliminate witnesses. He needed more. He needed proof so damning, so undeniable, that even Margaret's allies could not suppress it. Samuel had begun his investigation by researching Margaret's background more thoroughly, traveling to Harvard to examine the university's records. He had discovered that Margaret's father, Professor Klaus von Haussmann, had been dismissed from his position in 1835 under circumstances carefully obscured in the official documents. But Samuel had found a letter in the archives addressed by the university president to the board of overseers explaining the true reason for von Haussmann's removal. The professor had been conducting experiments on living subjects, orphans, and impoverished children obtained from poorhouses, attempting to measure inherited characteristics and test theories about the malleability of human intelligence through early intervention. When the experiments had come to light, the university had quietly terminated his employment and had paid sums to several families to guarantee their silence. Von Haussmann had died shortly thereafter, but his papers and research notes had been confiscated and sealed. Samuel had petitioned the university for access to those sealed materials, claiming he was researching hereditary disease. After weeks of bureaucratic obstruction, he had finally been granted limited access to the documents. What he found had been chilling. Von Haussmann had been consumed by the idea of creating what he called the perfected human, individuals free from inherited defects, possessing optimal physical and mental capabilities. His writings were filled with pseudoscientific theories about racial superiority, about the necessity of eliminating inferior stock, about the obligation of those with superior breeding to reproduce selectively. He had exchanged letters with like-minded academics across Europe, sharing data and refining theories that would later be recognized as profoundly immoral but which in the 1820s and 1830s had found audiences in certain intellectual circles. Among von Haussmann's papers, Samuel had found letters from his daughter Margaret written between 1845 and 1850. These letters had revealed that Margaret had not merely absorbed her father's theories. She had expanded them, refined them, waited patiently for the opportunity to put them into practice. Her marriage to Thomas Lawrence had been strategic, she had written, chosen specifically because Thomas came from a family with documented longevity and robust health. But Thomas himself had been an impediment. His conventional morality and religious convictions made him unsuitable as a genuine partner in her life's work. One letter dated November of 1850 had been particularly revealing. "Father, I have concluded that Thomas must be removed. He has discovered some of my preparations and has threatened to have me institutionalized if I persist in what he calls unnatural philosophies. He does not understand that we stand at the threshold of human transformation, that the methods you pioneered can be perfected. I have secured the support of several influential men who share our vision, men who understand that Boston's future depends on cultivating superior bloodlines. Once Thomas is gone, I will have the freedom and resources to proceed. The experiment will be my tribute to your memory." Samuel had studied that letter for a long time, understanding at last that Thomas Lawrence's death had been no accident. Margaret had murdered her own husband to clear the path for her experiment. And she had done so with the assistance of powerful conspirators, men whose identity Samuel still needed to uncover. He had copied several of the most incriminating documents, working late into the night in the Harvard archives, aware that this evidence could be suppressed or destroyed if Margaret learned of his investigation. The question now was how to deploy this information without placing himself and Catherine in immediate danger. The answer came from an unexpected source. In early June of 1854, Samuel had received a visitor at his practice. A lawyer named Josiah Fletcher, a man in his 60s with the measured bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating Boston's intricate social hierarchies. Fletcher had closed the door behind him and spoken quietly. "Dr. Hewitt, I represent the interests of the Lowell family. I understand you have been making inquiries about the death of Jonathan Lowell." Samuel's heart had quickened, uncertain whether this was a warning or an opportunity. "I am a physician, Mr. Fletcher. I take interest in any death that appears inconsistent with the official explanation." "As do I," Fletcher had replied. "Jonathan's father came to me several months ago with concerns about his son's final weeks. Jonathan had been drinking heavily, yes, but he had also been terrified of something he refused to name. He had come into a considerable sum of money, $3,000, but would not explain its source. And in the days before his death, he had confided to his father that he had done something terrible, something that would haunt him forever, and that powerful individuals wanted to ensure his silence." Fletcher had removed a document from his leather case and placed it on Samuel's desk. "This is Jonathan's contract with Margaret Lawrence. His father discovered it concealed among his papers after his death. It is carefully worded to appear innocuous, but the implications are unmistakable. Margaret Lawrence paid Jonathan to father a child with her daughter, and then had him killed to guarantee his silence. Samuel had examined the contract, his hands trembling slightly. This was the evidence he had needed, direct proof linking Margaret to Jonathan's death, written in legal language that could not be easily dismissed. "Why bring this to me?" Samuel had asked. "Because the Lowell family cannot openly act against Margaret Lawrence without destroying their own reputation," Fletcher had explained. If it became known that Jonathan participated in this arrangement, even under financial duress, the scandal would ruin the family's standing in Boston society. "But you, Doctor, carry no such constraints. You have been asking questions. You have treated members of the Lawrence household. You have legitimate grounds to investigate. If you were to bring charges against Margaret Lawrence, the Lowell family would support you quietly, would ensure that witnesses came forward, would use their influence to prevent the case from being buried." Samuel had understood then that he was being offered an alliance. The Lowell family's wealth and connections combined with his medical expertise and evidence might be sufficient to overcome Margaret's power. But he had also recognized the risks. "If I move against Margaret Lawrence, she will attempt to kill me," Samuel had said directly. "Yes," Fletcher had agreed. "She will. Which is precisely why you must act quickly and decisively, with enough evidence to have her arrested immediately before she can retaliate. The Lowell family has already contacted the families of William Elbridge and Henry Cunningham. Both have found similar contracts among their sons' belongings. Both are prepared to support criminal charges provided their involvement can remain confidential until Margaret is in custody." Over the days that followed, Samuel had collaborated with Fletcher to construct their case, assembling evidence from multiple sources. The contracts, the letters from Margaret to her father, Catherine's testimony about the poisoning attempt, Sophia's account of her vanished daughter, and Samuel's own observations from the third floor of the Lawrence mansion. But they had also uncovered something that complicated their plans considerably. While examining city records related to the deaths of Jonathan Lowell and the others, Fletcher had identified a pattern in the coroner's reports. All three deaths had been reviewed by the same coroner, a man named Virgil Danforth, who had consistently ruled them accidental despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Danforth had been appointed to his position through the influence of Judge Harrison Prentice, one of the men present at Thomas Lawrence's fatal dinner party. Further investigation had revealed that Judge Prentice was a member of a private organization called the Society for Human Advancement, founded in 1848 by several prominent Boston intellectuals influenced by von Hausmann's theories. The society gathered monthly at a private residence on Lewisburg Square, and its membership included several judges, 2 state legislators, a newspaper publisher, and the mayor's chief legal advisor. Margaret Lawrence had been corresponding with members of this society since her husband's death, and they had been offering her protection and support for her experiment. They regarded her work as a practical application of theories they had only discussed in abstract terms, a real-world test of whether selective breeding could improve the human species. In exchange for observing and documenting her results, they had employed their positions to shield her from scrutiny and eliminate obstacles threatening her work. This was not simply a case of one wealthy woman committing murder. This was a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in Boston, men who believed they were advancing a higher purpose by permitting Margaret to continue her grotesque experiment. Just when Samuel and Fletcher had believed they understood the conspiracy's full scope, the horror unfolding on Beacon Hill was about to intensify. If this story is sending chills through you, share this video with someone who appreciates dark mysteries, press that like button to support our content, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next. The true depths of Margaret's depravity were still to be revealed. Samuel had recognized that exposing Margaret Lawrence would demand more than documents and testimony. He would need physical evidence of her crimes, evidence so overwhelming that even her powerful allies could not suppress it. That meant gaining access once more to the third floor of the Lawrence mansion, this time to search thoroughly for proof of what had befallen the unsuitable children Margaret had removed from her study. His opportunity arrived in late June when another urgent summons appeared. Elizabeth Lawrence was experiencing severe abdominal pain requiring immediate medical attention. Samuel had packed his medical bag and set out for the mansion, but this time he had come prepared to accomplish more than treating a patient. Elizabeth's condition had proven to be a prolapsed uterus, dangerous but not immediately life-threatening. Samuel had been able to provide temporary relief, but he had informed Margaret that Elizabeth would require ongoing treatment over several days. Margaret had consented, and Samuel had been granted regular access to the third floor. During his third visit, while Margaret was occupied with household matters downstairs, Samuel had made his move. He had asked the attending nurse to fetch additional clean linens, providing himself a few minutes alone on the third floor. He had moved swiftly through the corridor, testing door handles until finding one that was locked. A door at the far end of the hallway, past the nursery where the surviving children were kept. Samuel had used a medical probe to work the lock, a technique learned from a locksmith patient who had been grateful for Samuel's treatment of his daughter. The lock yielded, and Samuel had slipped inside, pulling the door quietly shut behind him. The room beyond had been fitted as a laboratory. Shelves lined the walls holding glass jars containing specimens preserved in alcohol, organs, tissue samples, and specimens that made Samuel's stomach revolt. On a central table he had discovered Margaret's complete research records, detailed ledgers documenting not merely the 3 living children from the Lawrence daughters but 7 previous attempts spanning the past 2 years. Margaret had been conducting her experiment longer than anyone had realized. Before contracting with Jonathan Lowell and the others, she had been testing her methods on servants and hired women, paying them to become pregnant by men Margaret had selected, then taking the infants after birth. Of the 7 children from these preliminary trials, only 2 had met Margaret's standards. The remaining 5 had been classified as unsuitable and removed. Samuel had found detailed notes explaining the grounds for each rejection. Subject E1 had displayed signs of developmental delay at 6 months. Subject F1 had contracted whooping cough and been deemed constitutionally fragile. Subject G1 had possessed what Margaret described as unfortunate facial asymmetry, suggesting inferior bloodline despite careful selection. But what truly horrified Samuel was what he found in the preservation jars. Margaret had not simply removed the unsuitable children. She had been performing autopsies on them, dissecting their organs, documenting her findings with scientific precision. She had been attempting to identify physical indicators of inferiority that could be detected earlier so that future subjects could be eliminated before significant resources were invested in their care. The children had been killed, suffocated, Samuel determined from Margaret's clinical descriptions, and their bodies had then been employed as research materials. Margaret had been treating human infants as laboratory specimens with no greater moral consideration than a scientist might extend to dissecting a frog. Samuel had been photographing the ledger pages with a small camera he had borrowed, a recent innovation becoming more common in medical documentation, when he heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. He had quickly closed the ledgers, pocketed the photographic plates, and was examining the preservation jars more closely when the door swung open. Margaret Lawrence stood in the doorway, her face utterly composed, betraying no surprise or alarm at finding Samuel in her private laboratory. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said calmly. "You have been asking too many questions, Dr. Hewitt, making inquiries at Harvard, consulting with lawyers, attending to my daughters with an unusual level of interest. I have been watching you." Samuel had felt his hand move toward his medical bag, where he had concealed a small pistol Fletcher had insisted he carry, but Margaret had smiled, a cold expression that never reached her eyes. "There is no need for violence, Doctor. We are both civilized people. Surely we can discuss this rationally." "You have murdered children," Samuel had said, his voice shaking with fury and horror. "You have killed the fathers of your grandchildren. You have poisoned your own daughter. There is nothing rational about what you have done." "On the contrary," Margaret had replied, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "What I have done is entirely rational. I have applied scientific principles to the improvement of the human species. Every farmer culls inferior livestock. Every gardener removes weak seedlings. Why should humans be exempt from these same principles of selection? The children I removed would have lived unremarkable lives, contributing nothing of value to society. The men I eliminated had served their purpose and had become liabilities. These were rational decisions made in service of a greater goal. And what goal could possibly justify murdering children? Samuel had demanded. The creation of a superior human line, Margaret had answered, her voice carrying the certainty of true fanaticism. In 3 generations my descendants will be healthier, more intelligent, more capable than ordinary human beings. They will be the foundation of a new aristocracy, grounded not in accumulated wealth but in biological excellence. They will lead this nation into a future of unprecedented achievement. Can you not perceive the magnificence of this vision? Samuel had regarded her steadily, recognizing at last that he was not confronting simple criminality but genuine madness clothed in the language of science. Margaret Lawrence genuinely believed she was serving humanity through her monstrous actions. You will never see that future, Samuel had said. I have evidence of everything you have done, contracts, correspondence, witness testimony. I am taking you to the authorities today. Margaret's expression had not shifted. No, Dr. Hewitt, you are not. Because if you attempt to expose me, I will ensure that everyone you care about suffers. Your practice will be destroyed by accusations of incompetence. Your family in Salem will face financial ruin through litigation. And you will be found dead, another unfortunate victim of the violence that plagues our city. I have resources you cannot imagine and allies who will protect me because they understand the importance of my work. She had approached him, her gray eyes fixed on his face with predatory intensity. But I am prepared to offer you an alternative. Join us, Dr. Hewitt. The Society for Human Advancement could benefit greatly from a young physician with your skills. Help us refine our methods. Document our results with medical precision. You would be part of something larger than yourself, something that will endure long after we are all gone. Samuel had realized with cold certainty that Margaret believed she could recruit him, could draw him into her conspiracy through a combination of threats and appeals to scientific ambition. She had done this before, he understood, identifying potential obstacles and either eliminating or converting them into allies. I will never help you, Samuel had said. Margaret had sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. Then you have chosen poorly, Doctor. I had hoped you would be reasonable. She had turned toward the door, clearly intending to summon assistance to have Samuel removed from the mansion and most likely killed before he could reach the authorities. But Samuel had moved faster. He had seized his medical bag, withdrawn the pistol, and leveled it directly at Margaret's chest. You are coming with me to the police station, he had said. Now. Margaret had regarded the weapon with curiosity rather than alarm. You are a physician, Dr. Hewitt. You have taken an oath to do no harm. You will not shoot me. You are correct that I will not shoot to kill, Samuel had replied. But I will gladly wound you if necessary. A bullet through your shoulder will not be fatal, yet it will prevent you from escaping while I summon the authorities. Your choice, Mrs. Lawrence. For the first time, Samuel had detected uncertainty in Margaret's expression. She had calculated the odds and realized Samuel might actually fire. Her hand, which had been reaching for the door handle, hesitated. But before either could act, the door burst open and Catherine Lawrence entered, breathing heavily as though she had been running. In her hand she held a kitchen knife, its blade catching the afternoon light from the laboratory windows. Step away from my mother, Catherine had said, her voice carrying an edge Samuel had never heard before. Samuel had stared at her in bewilderment. Catherine, she has been poisoning you. She planned to kill you. I am trying to help. I know what she planned, Catherine had interrupted. And I know what you have discovered, but you do not understand everything, Dr. Hewitt. You do not understand what we have become." Margaret had smiled then, a genuine expression of satisfaction. "Catherine has proven more adaptable than I anticipated." "Tell him, my dear." Catherine had moved closer, the knife still held firmly. "For months, I did what my mother demanded because I was terrified. I was a prisoner in this house, compelled to bear a child by a stranger, treated like livestock. But then I came to realize something, Doctor. My mother is correct, not about everything, but about the fundamental principle. We live in a world that prizes strength over weakness, intelligence over ignorance, capability over mediocrity. My son will mature with every advantage: wealth, education, health. He will be superior to ordinary children, not through any mystical bloodline, but because of the resources and knowledge that will be devoted to his development." "She has been murdering children," Samuel had said desperately. "How can you possibly defend that?" "I have seen the children my mother removed," Catherine had replied, her voice cold. "Some were sickly, some malformed, some showed signs of idiocy or other defects. Would it have been more merciful to allow them to live diminished lives, to suffer through childhood and die young regardless, or to bring suffering to families unable to properly care for them? My mother made difficult decisions, yes, but she made them based on reason and observation rather than sentiment." Samuel had grasped then that Margaret had not merely imprisoned her daughters. She had systematically indoctrinated them, gradually transforming them from victims into willing participants in her horrific experiment. Catherine had developed what physicians were beginning to describe as identification with the captor, a psychological adaptation in which prisoners come to adopt the beliefs and objectives of those who hold them captive. "Elizabeth feels the same way," Catherine had continued, "and did so before she died. We understand now what our mother is attempting to achieve, and we will not allow you to destroy it." The situation had deteriorated rapidly. Samuel had been trapped in the laboratory with two women prepared to kill him to protect their secret, and his sole weapon was a pistol he was genuinely reluctant to discharge. He had trained as a physician to preserve lives, not to end them. The thought of shooting Catherine, even in self-defense, had been nearly unbearable. But he had also known that if he failed to escape that room, he would never leave the Lawrence mansion alive. The confrontation in Margaret's laboratory had lasted only seconds, yet to Samuel time had appeared to slow. Every detail had burned into his memory with crystalline clarity. Catherine had been advancing toward him, the kitchen knife wielded with surprising competence, her face set with determination. Margaret had been retreating toward a cabinet along the wall where Samuel suspected she kept additional weapons or perhaps chemicals that might be weaponized. Samuel had reached his decision in an instant. He had swung his medical bag forcefully at Catherine's knife hand, connecting solidly enough to make her cry out and release the blade. Then he had lunged for the door, wrenching it open and sprinting into the corridor. Behind him he heard Margaret shouting for the servants, her voice sharp with command. Footsteps thundered up the staircase, the butler and two other male servants, all physically larger and stronger than Samuel. Samuel had run toward the main staircase, but it had been blocked by the approaching servants. He reversed direction, racing toward the back stairs descending to the kitchen level. Behind him he heard Catherine screaming, "Stop him! He has taken documents. He must not leave." The back stairs had been narrow and dark, illuminated only by a single gas lamp. Samuel had taken them two at a time, his medical bag bouncing against his hip, his heart pounding so forcefully he thought it might give out. He had emerged into the kitchen where several maids looked up in surprise from their work. "Fire!" Samuel had shouted, the first thing that occurred to him. "Fire on the third floor! Everyone out!" The panic his words ignited had been precisely what he needed. The maids had begun screaming and rushing toward the exits, creating chaos that slowed his pursuers. Samuel had joined the exodus, bursting through the kitchen door into the mansion's rear garden. He had run through the formal landscaping, past rose bushes and sculpted hedges, toward the iron fence surrounding the property. Behind him he could hear the butler directing the servants to split up, to cover all exits, to prevent Samuel from escaping with stolen property. The fence stood 8 feet tall, topped with decorative spikes. Samuel had hurled his medical bag over it, hearing it land with a heavy thud on the sidewalk beyond. Then he had grabbed the iron bars and begun climbing, his hands slipping on the painted metal, his shoes finding precarious purchase on the decorative scrollwork. He had been halfway up when someone seized his ankle. Looking down, he saw the butler pulling at his leg, attempting to drag him back. Samuel had kicked hard, his heel connecting with the man's face. The butler had stumbled backward, blood pouring from his nose, and Samuel had scrambled the remaining distance up the fence. The decorative spikes at the top had torn through his coat and gashed his arm, but Samuel had barely registered the pain. He had thrown himself over the fence and dropped heavily onto the sidewalk, rolling to absorb the impact. He had snatched his medical bag and run, his wounded arm leaving drops of blood on the pavement behind him. Behind him he had heard Margaret's voice calling out, calm and authoritative. "Let him go. Notify Judge Prentice immediately. Dr. Hewitt will not reach the authorities." Samuel had run 6 blocks before burning lungs forced him to slow to a walk. He was in a residential neighborhood, late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street. Respectable citizens stared at him, his torn coat, his bleeding arm, his desperate gasping breaths. But no one came forward to help. In Boston, one did not involve oneself in the troubles of strangers. He had understood then that going directly to the police would be suicide. Margaret would have already dispatched word to her allies, and any officer Samuel encountered would be looking for him, prepared to arrest him on fabricated charges or simply make him disappear. He had needed somewhere safe, somewhere Margaret's reach could not immediately extend. He had made his way to Fletcher's law office on Court Street, checking constantly to ensure he was not being followed. Fletcher had been working late, reviewing documents by lamplight, and had looked up in alarm when Samuel burst through his door. "Good God, what happened?" Fletcher had demanded, taking in Samuel's disheveled appearance and bleeding arm. Samuel had recounted everything: the laboratory, the preserved specimens, the ledgers documenting murdered children, the confrontation with Margaret and Catherine, the desperate flight. As he spoke, Fletcher's expression had grown increasingly grave. "We must move at once," Fletcher had said when Samuel finished. "Margaret will be mobilizing her allies even now. We have perhaps a few hours before they fabricate some account painting you as the criminal, theft, assault, perhaps even an attempt on the Lawrence daughters. You need to be in protective custody before they can act." "Can we trust any of the police?" Samuel had asked. "Not in Boston proper," Fletcher had replied. "But I have a contact in the Massachusetts State Police, a captain named Reginald Barnes, who has no ties to Beacon Hill society. He is an honest man, frustrated by the corruption he witnesses in the city. If we can reach him and present our evidence, he will protect you while we build the case." Fletcher had bandaged Samuel's arm, provided him with a fresh coat, and they had left the office through a rear entrance. They had hired a coach to take them to the state police barracks in Roxbury, a journey of several miles that felt interminable. Samuel had fully expected to be stopped, to see Margaret's hired men blocking the road, but they had reached their destination without incident. Captain Barnes had been a square-jawed man in his 50s with the weathered countenance of someone who had spent years dealing with criminals. He had listened to Samuel's account with careful attention, occasionally asking pointed questions, his eyes sharp with intelligence. "These are grave accusations against very powerful people," Barnes had said when Samuel concluded. "If you are mistaken, or your evidence proves insufficient, you will be destroyed." "Are you certain about this?" "I have seen the bodies of murdered infants preserved in jars," Samuel had replied, his voice trembling with emotion. "I have read ledgers documenting their deaths. I have contracts demonstrating that Margaret Lawrence paid men to impregnate her daughters and then had those men killed. I am absolutely certain." Barnes had nodded slowly. "Then we need to move quickly. I will take a squad of men to the Lawrence mansion tonight and secure the premises. We will seize all documents and evidence before they can be destroyed. You will remain here under guard until this is resolved." But Fletcher had shaken his head. "Captain, if you raid the mansion, Judge Prentice and the others will claim you are acting without authority, will manufacture legal obstacles, will have you removed from your position. We need to go higher. We need to involve the governor." Barnes had considered this, then nodded. "Governor Clifford is in Boston this week. I can request an emergency audience. If we can present the evidence directly to him, he can provide the authority we need to move against the conspirators, even those who include members of the judiciary." They had worked through the night organizing their evidence and preparing their presentation. Samuel had contributed his photographs of the ledger pages, the contracts supplied by the Lowell family, Catherine's testimony about the poisoning attempt, Sophia's account of her missing daughter, and his own detailed observations from the third floor. By dawn, they had been ready. Captain Barnes had dispatched a messenger to the governor's residence requesting an urgent meeting on matters of public safety and criminal conspiracy. The response came within the hour. Governor Clifford would receive them at 8 that morning. Samuel had felt hope for the first time since escaping the Lawrence mansion. Perhaps they could actually bring Margaret and her conspirators to justice. Perhaps the evidence would prove strong enough to overcome even their considerable influence. But as they were preparing to depart for the governor's residence, a messenger arrived with news that overturned everything. The Lawrence mansion had burned during the night. The fire had been discovered around 3 in the morning, and by the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the entire structure had been engulfed. The blaze had burned so intensely and spread so rapidly that nothing could be salvaged. The mansion had been reduced to smoldering rubble, and everyone inside, Margaret Lawrence, her 2 surviving daughters, the 3 infants, and all the household servants had perished. Samuel had stood in the captain's office feeling as though the floor had dissolved beneath him. All the evidence he needed had been inside that mansion, the laboratory, the ledgers, the preserved specimens, and now it was gone, consumed in a fire so convenient it could only have been deliberately set. "She burned it," Samuel had said quietly. "Margaret knew we were coming for her. She destroyed everything. She killed her own daughters and grandchildren to protect her secrets." But Fletcher had been studying the messenger's expression, noting something he had not yet disclosed. "What are you not telling us?" the lawyer had asked. The messenger, a young police officer, had shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, something about the fire is peculiar. The bodies we have recovered, there are not enough of them. We found remains in the rubble, yes, but not as many as there should have been if everyone in the household perished. And there is more. A carriage was seen departing the mansion around midnight, several hours before the fire broke out. The driver has not been located." Samuel's mind had raced. If Margaret had escaped, if she had taken the children and fled before setting the fire, then she might still be brought to justice. But where would she go? She could not remain in Boston. Too many people now knew about her crimes. She would need to vanish entirely, to begin again somewhere her name and face were unknown. "The docks," Fletcher had said suddenly. "If she has left Boston, she would go by ship. We need to examine departures from last night and this morning." Captain Barnes had immediately dispatched officers to the harbor with orders to check passenger manifests for any ships departing since midnight. Samuel, Fletcher, and Barnes had then proceeded to their meeting with Governor Clifford, where they presented their evidence and explained what had transpired. Governor Clifford had been a pragmatic politician, less concerned with the ethical dimensions of Margaret's experiment than with the political scandal it represented. "You are telling me that several judges, legislators, and the mayor's own advisor have been complicit in multiple murders," he had said, his face darkening. "If this becomes public, it will destroy confidence in the entire government." Which is precisely why it must become public, Fletcher had argued. These men have betrayed the trust of the people they were sworn to serve. They must face justice. The governor had eventually concurred, though he had insisted on managing the narrative. The investigation would proceed, but carefully, with attention to protecting the institutions even as individual criminals were prosecuted. Samuel had felt disgust at this political calculation, but recognized the necessity. If they moved too aggressively, the conspirators might employ their positions to suppress the investigation entirely. By late morning, Captain Barnes' officers had returned with significant intelligence. A vessel called the Bremen Star had departed for Hamburg at first light, carrying among its passengers a widow traveling under the name Margaret von Haussmann, accompanied by 2 adult daughters and 3 young children. The description matched the Lawrence family precisely. "She is returning to Germany," Samuel had said. "Back to her father's academic circle, where her theories might find a more receptive audience." "Can we extradite her?" "Not easily," Barnes had replied. "We have no formal treaty with the German states for the return of criminals. We could request her return through diplomatic channels, but it would take months, and there is no assurance the German authorities would cooperate, particularly if she has influential connections there." Samuel had felt a crushing sense of failure. Margaret Lawrence had murdered at least 12 people, 5 infants from her preliminary experiments, Sophia's daughter, 3 young men who had fathered her grandchildren, her own daughter, and through medical neglect, her husband Thomas, and potentially numerous servants who had perished in the fire. Yet she had escaped justice entirely. She would live out her days in Germany, perhaps continuing her grotesque experiments, protected by distance and the constraints of international law. But Fletcher had not surrendered. "Even if Margaret escapes, we can still prosecute her co-conspirators. Judge Prentice, Coroner Danforth, the members of the Society for Human Advancement, they enabled her crimes and helped conceal them. We have documents proving their involvement. We can ensure they face consequences even if Margaret does not." The investigation that followed had been unlike anything Boston had previously witnessed. Governor Clifford had appointed a special prosecutor with broad authority to pursue the case wherever it led. Captain Barnes and his men had raided the Society for Human Advancement's gathering place, seizing correspondence and membership records. They had arrested Coroner Danforth, whose meticulous records of his dealings with Margaret provided devastating evidence of the cover-up. Judge Prentice had proven more difficult to handle. As a sitting judge, he could not be readily arrested and had immediately employed his position to resist the investigation, filing legal motions and calling in favors from other members of the judiciary. But the evidence against him had been substantial. Letters he had written to Margaret offering his support, records of payments he had received to guarantee favorable rulings, testimony from servants who had seen him visiting the Lawrence mansion late at night. The scandal had erupted across Boston in July of 1854. Newspapers had published sensational accounts of the Beacon Hill conspiracy, though many details had been suppressed to protect the families involved. The public had been stunned to discover that some of their most respected citizens had been complicit in murder and criminal conspiracy, all in service of pseudo-scientific theories about human breeding. The trials had commenced in August. Coroner Danforth, faced with overwhelming evidence, had agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony had exposed the conspiracy's full extent, not merely the murders Margaret had committed but also earlier crimes that had been suppressed, suspicious deaths ruled accidental, evidence that had been destroyed or falsified. Judge Prentice had fought until the end, employing every legal maneuver available, but his position had become untenable when 3 other members of the Society for Human Advancement had turned state's evidence. In October of 1854, he had been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The trial had been sensational, drawing observers from across the country, though the most disturbing details, the preserved infant bodies, the detailed breeding records, had been presented in closed sessions to protect public decency. Other society members had faced varying consequences. 2 legislators had resigned in disgrace. The mayor's legal advisor had been dismissed and had fled to Canada. The newspaper publisher had employed his influence to avoid criminal charges but had been compelled to sell his publications and withdraw from public life. Catherine and Elizabeth Lawrence had never been located. Whether they had genuinely escaped to Germany with Margaret or had died in the mansion fire remained unresolved. The bodies recovered from the ruins had been too severely burned for positive identification, and German authorities reported no record of anyone matching their descriptions entering the country. Samuel had suspected that Margaret had killed her surviving daughters before fleeing. They had known too much, had been potential witnesses against her. But he could never prove it. The trials concluded in early 1855 and Boston had begun the slow process of recovering from the scandal. But the damage to public trust had been profound. Citizens had come to understand that their most respected institutions, the courts, the police, the government, could be corrupted by wealth and influence, that horrific crimes could be perpetrated and concealed by those in power. Samuel Hewitt had become something of a public figure, celebrated by reformers as an example of moral courage and reviled by Boston's elite as a troublemaker who had brought distinguished families to ruin. His medical practice had suffered considerably. Many of Beacon Hill's wealthy residents had refused to see him, viewing him as a traitor to his class. But he had gained new patients among merchants, workingmen, and immigrants who respected what he had done. Sophia Prescott, the young woman whose daughter had been among Margaret's victims, had provided testimony during the trials that moved many observers to tears. She had described watching her infant taken away, had spoken of months spent wondering what had become of her child, and had finally learned the truth through Samuel's investigation. The public sympathy she received had led to a small pension being established in her name by the state, an acknowledgement that she had been a victim of crimes the government had failed to prevent. Fletcher had continued his legal work but had become increasingly devoted to reform efforts, advocating for legislation that would make it harder for wealthy individuals to evade justice through corruption and influence. He had drafted laws requiring multiple physicians to sign off on suspicious death certificates, establishing oversight that might have forestalled Coroner Danforth's falsifications. The three surviving children, Catherine's son, Elizabeth's daughter, and Anne's son, had been placed with relatives of their biological fathers following extensive legal proceedings. The Lowell family had taken Catherine's boy, the Elbridge family had accepted Elizabeth's daughter, and the Cunningham family had reluctantly agreed to raise Anne's son. These children would grow up ignorant of their origins, sheltered from the horrific circumstances of their conception, protected by families that had agreed to bury the past entirely. The mansion's ruins had been cleared away, and the property had eventually been purchased by a textile merchant who had erected a new home on the site. But Beacon Hill residents would always remember what had stood there before, and mothers walking past with their children would quicken their pace, as though something malevolent might still linger in the very soil. Samuel had received a letter in March of 1855, postmarked from Hamburg. It had contained no return address, no signature, only a few lines inscribed in elegant script. Dr. Hewitt, you believe you have prevailed, but you have merely postponed the inevitable. The principles I applied remain valid regardless of your narrow-minded morality. In Germany, I have found colleagues who appreciate the significance of my work. The experiment continues, and in time the results will vindicate everything I have done. You saved no one. You merely ensured that progress will occur beyond your reach, beyond your ability to interfere. History will remember me as a pioneer and you as the men who attempted to hold back the tide of human advancement. Samuel had burned the letter, yet its words had haunted him. Margaret Lawrence was still out there, still pursuing her grotesque vision, and he was powerless to intervene. He had preserved lives in Boston, had exposed a conspiracy, had brought criminals before justice, but the architect of it all had escaped, and somewhere in Europe she might be continuing her experiments, creating new victims he would never know existed. Years later, in 1867, Samuel had received a visit from a German physician named Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, who had been traveling through America examining medical practices. Over dinner, Hartmann had mentioned that he had once encountered a peculiar situation in Hamburg, a wealthy widow who had been operating a private children's home, claiming to conduct educational experiments on orphans. The authorities had eventually launched an investigation, Hartmann had said, after several children died under mysterious circumstances. The woman had fled before she could be arrested, taking several children with her. Her name had been von Hausmann, if he recalled correctly. The case had caused quite a controversy. Samuel's blood had turned cold. When did this occur? Around 1858 or 1859, I believe. The woman was never found. Some suspected she had gone to America, actually. Samuel had offered nothing further on the subject, but he had grasped then that Margaret's crimes had not ceased with her departure from Boston. She had continued her work in Germany until the authorities closed in, then had vanished again, perhaps returning to America under an assumed identity, perhaps moving on to some other country where her wealth and intelligence could purchase the freedom to continue. The thought was deeply unsettling that Margaret Lawrence might be anywhere, might even be living in America again, pursuing her experiments in secret, producing new victims. But Samuel had also recognized there was nothing he could do about it. He had no authority to investigate crimes in foreign countries, no means of tracking a woman who possessed the resources and cunning to disappear completely. What he could do was continue his own work, treating patients with compassion and integrity, mentoring young physicians to value human life above scientific curiosity, and speaking out against the eugenic theories gaining currency in academic circles. The ideas that had driven Margaret Lawrence were not unique to her. They were spreading, being refined, being clothed in increasingly sophisticated scientific language. Samuel had made it his mission to oppose these ideas wherever he encountered them, to argue that human beings could not be reduced to breeding stock, that the worth of a life could not be measured by physical perfection or intellectual achievement. In 1870, Samuel had published a book titled The Beacon Hill Tragedy, a physician's account of murder and pseudoscience. The volume had recounted everything he had uncovered about Margaret Lawrence's crimes, though he had altered some names to protect the innocent. It had been controversial, with some readers applauding his courage while others denounced him for sensationalism, yet it had achieved Samuel's primary objective, ensuring that the story would not be forgotten, that future generations would know what had transpired when scientific theory was severed from moral restraint. The book's final chapter had posed a question Samuel believed every generation would need to answer anew. How do we reconcile the pursuit of knowledge with respect for human dignity? How do we prevent the powerful from treating the vulnerable as mere instruments of their ambitions? These are not questions that can be resolved once and for all. They must be confronted freshly by each generation, in each new context where human life hangs in the balance. Samuel Hewitt had continued his medical practice in Boston until his death in 1889 at the age of 64. He had never married, devoting his life entirely to his work and the reform causes he championed. His funeral had been attended by hundreds of patients and colleagues, and the eulogy had honored him as a man who had sacrificed personal advancement to stand for what was right. Margaret Lawrence was never definitively located following her disappearance from Hamburg in 1858. Some historians believe she died in obscurity somewhere in Europe. Others have speculated that she returned to America under an assumed name and continued her work in secret. No conclusive evidence has ever emerged to settle the question. The 3 children born from her experiment lived ordinary lives, unaware of their origins. Catherine's son became a banker, Elizabeth's daughter married a minister, and Anne's son became a schoolteacher. None displayed any of the superiority Margaret had attempted to engineer, but neither were they in any respect inferior to their peers. They were simply people, shaped more by their upbringing and their choices than by the genetic manipulation their grandmother had attempted. The Society for Human Advancement disbanded following the trials, but its ideas did not vanish. The eugenic theories that had motivated Margaret Lawrence would gain renewed momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, contributing to forced sterilization programs, immigration restrictions grounded in racial theories, and ultimately to some of the greatest atrocities of the modern era. Margaret Lawrence had been an early proponent of these ideas in America, and the fact that she had been stopped in Boston did not prevent others from taking up her cause elsewhere. The mansion's site remained residential property, and over the decades the memory of what had occurred there faded from public awareness. By the early 20th century, few Bostonians recalled the scandal that had once horrified their city. The story became a footnote in local history books, a strange episode from a darker time. But the questions Margaret Lawrence had raised about human improvement, about science's role in shaping society, about who holds the right to determine which lives have value, those questions never faded. They remain with us today in altered forms, demanding answers no easier now than they were in 1854. This mystery reminds us that the greatest horrors often arise not from supernatural forces but from human beings who believe their intelligence grants them the right to treat others as objects of study rather than as fellow human beings deserving dignity and compassion. What do you make of this story? Do you believe Margaret Lawrence truly evaded justice, or did her crimes eventually find her out? Leave your thoughts below. If you appreciated this tale and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. The past holds many more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we will keep bringing them to light. See you in the next video.